Hello everyone and welcome to this video. My name is Amit or Ekaros, as you can find me on the various Magic platforms, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube. And I'm a competitive Magic player and a content creator from Israel. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite decks in Pioneer, Vampires. This deck has brought me a lot of success recently and I think it's quite well positioned right now in the format. We're going to talk about what kind of deck Vampires is, and I'm going to talk about some of the card choices and what's the plan, what makes this deck good. Then I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks, and finally sum up with the sideboard and its role in different matchups. You can find the Decklist portable below in the description of this video with links to some of my other content. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the deck. Vampires is an aggressive mid-range deck where the goal is to deploy threats that both generate advantage, either board advantage, card advantage, or tempo advantage, while putting your opponent on the back foot, forcing them to answer your threats in an awkward manner, and thus winning the game either by grinding them out with your superior threats, or making them die with answers that are inappropriate for what you have in play. Now, this deck is composed of 5 different parts. We're going to go over each and every one of them and see what role it plays in the deck and how it's supporting the main plan. The first part is these cheap vampires. Basically, we're talking about 4 copies of Knight of the Ebon Legion, 4 copies of Gifted Aetherborn, 2 copies of Null Priest of Oblivion, and 3 copies of Dusk Legion Zealot. Now, importantly, these are all vampires. We're going to figure out why this matters really soon when we get to the other cards here. But why do we play these threats? Well, basically, our threats here, as we mentioned, generate some kind of advantage when we play them. Knight of the Ebon Legion and Gifted Aetherborn pull a lot of weight, much more than the weight you would expect a 1-drop and a 2-drop to pull. Knight gets pumped either by the counters or by its ability to gain Death Touch and +3/+3 until end of turn, making it dominate combat in early stages and late stages of the game. Gifted Aetherborn, as a 2/3 lifelink Death Touch creature, dominates boards in the early game, but maintains its relevancy even in later stages of the game. And then we have the 3 copies of Dusk Legion Zealot, which basically is an Elvish Visionary that also draws us a card and loses us life, but is a vampire. So it helps the synergies of this deck and just generates a lot more cardboard. And last but not least, of the 2 drops, we have Null Priest of Oblivion. A 2/1 Menace lifelink is basically a worse version of Gifted Aetherborn, but the kicker puts this one over the top because drawing this later in the game often equals drawing the best creature in your yard attached to the 2/1 lifelink Menace. So these are the cheap threats that help us create an advantage on the board in the early game. The second part of the deck is Sorin. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Sorin now because I'm going to dedicate a whole section to it in a couple of minutes. But basically Sorin with Champion of Dusk is the reason to be vampires. We're going to touch on that in a couple of minutes. Now, Sorin is the second part. The third part is the heavy hitting vampires. We have Kalitas, which is an all-around good creature, and then we have Champion of Dusk, which in a Vampires deck is basically like a Moldrifter on steroids, drawing us a bunch of cards and generating board presence at the same time, giving this deck its staying power and its long game ability to grind. The fourth part is the interactive part, which are the interaction cards. We have 4 Fatal Pushes, 4 Thoughtseize, 3 Murderous Rider. These cards need no introduction. They're the most efficient interactive spells in Pioneer, and especially in the black color, and are what makes this deck able to compete with some of its softer opponents. Now, the last part, but absolutely not the least part, is the land suit. Look at these lands. We're playing 4 Castle Octwain, which gives us the ability to draw extra cards. We're playing 2 Aghanim's Awakening, the newest addition to the deck from Zendikar Rising, giving us a split spell between a reanimation card and a land drop. And we're playing 4 Mutavaults, which are not only a good aggressive mainland, but also provide more vampires for the deck because the Mutavault becomes a 2/2 creature with every creature type on it. Now, these are the main deck, these are the parts. Let's go ahead and talk about why this deck is even good. So, I think the way to sum this up is basically Sorin, or at least this is where we want to start actually. Sorin is one of the strongest cards printed in recent years, and recent years have been flooded with good cards. Sorin is a planeswalker, 3 mana planeswalker, that can come down on turn 3 really early and go up to 5 loyalty. Reminds you of something? Well, if Oko comes to mind, then this is a good comparison. Sorin, like Oko, has 2 abilities that help him gain more loyalty, and coming down this early means it's really hard to remove it from the board. Now, let's take a look at the abilities. The first one gives a creature you control Death Touch and lifelink until end of turn. This is an aggressive ability because it lets your creatures attack into any board state, but even more importantly, if your creature is a vampire, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This might seem small, but it's not small in the early game, where pumping up a creature can throw off all the combat math your opponent has done and prepared to do, giving you better blockers, better attacks, and in general, just better creatures. The second ability is even stronger, and now you might be surprised. Looking at it, you might say, but what, Amit, this ability is actually card disadvantage. You may sacrifice a vampire to deal 3 damage to target creature, to any target, my bad, and gain 3 life? Why would I want to do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons you would want to do that. The first one is that this basically means that you can force a trade between one of your creatures and one of your opponent's creatures, which is a deceptively strong ability. Sometimes your opponent would want to use a removal spell to prevent that trade and deal damage to your Sorin. Sometimes your creature is just worse than theirs. This ability basically goes around all of these options your opponents have and just say, okay, we now trade these cards and you have nothing to do about it. So this ability is quite strong. Moreover, this targets anything. So this ability can also kill planeswalkers and kill players. I have used Sorin to kill players from 12 or more life over a couple of turns, and it's really hard to interact with and really surprising to have damage reach coming from a mono black deck. The third ability though is what makes this deck tick. -3 to put a vampire creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. This is extremely strong, especially in combination with Champion of Dusk, which lets you draw cards equal to the number of vampires you have in play when it comes into play, and is a 4/4/4/5. So on turn 3 you can get basically the biggest Moldrifter ever. Now, what the third ability does and why it is so strong is it generates 2 kinds of advantages. The first one is the tempo advantage. Imagine just going Gifted Aetherborn into Sorin minus put into play another Gifted Aetherborn. You have just deployed 2 permanents on turn 3, so basically you double spelled, but these permanents are really difficult to interact with and hard to answer, and if you don't answer them, they're gonna take over the game. So Sorin generates tempo advantage. The second kind of advantage is obviously the mana advantage. The ability does not cost you mana to play, which gives you a lot of really strong lines we're gonna go over later. But basically the -3 ability is the way you take over games and snowball early. So we talked about Sorin being the reason, together with Champion of Dusk, to play vampires. But it's not the reason, it doesn't tell us about this strategy and the way this deck plays out. So I think we can understand how this deck is good and what's it trying to do by talking about 3 features the deck has and how they combine to give this deck a very unique ability in the Pioneer format. So the first feature I'm going to talk about is racing. This deck is the best deck for racing in the Pioneer format. Now you might be surprised and think about decks like Mono Black Aggro and Burn, but in practice this deck is just better at doing it. It does not goldfish faster, but it does race better. Why is that? I think the epitome of this is the 6/2 drops here. Gifted Aetherborn and Null Priest both present 2 power of lifelink that is really hard to block. So especially for on the play, but even on the draw, just deploying one of these on turn 2 and starting to attack puts your opponent in a really awkward spot. Do you start racing back, meaning you have to generate more and more board because I keep gaining more and more life? Or do you try and block these creatures that are really hard to profitably trade for in combat? Sorry. So it starts with these 2 creatures, but it doesn't end there. Sorin basically makes any of your creatures into a lifelinker, or giving you a free lightning helix every turn, or just generating tempo advantage, as mentioned, making racing even harder for your opponent. And then when you get to the heavy hitters, you understand that playing Kalitas is another 3/4 lifelinker that punishes your opponent for trading resources, and Champion is just a really big card that draws you more cards, making racing kind of awkward. The interactive spells obviously play a very important role, because if your opponent is trying to generate profitable blocks, Fatal Push, or Rider can stop these, or Thoughtseize can just take their mass removal spells or their key hammer from their hands. Now, racing is one aspect of the deck, which makes it really, really good. The second feature I want to touch on is the fact that this deck is one of the best long game decks in the format. Yes, you are an aggressive mid-range deck, but you can fight the long game versus almost any other deck in the format, including Niv Mizzet and Yorion decks. How does this happen? Well, two subsets of cards make this happen. The first one, and it's the obvious one, is the Champion of Dusk. Champion often draws you into 2-3 more cards, and you can recur it with Null Priest of Oblivion, and you can put it into play earlier with the Sorin, meaning you can start chaining vampires, chaining champions very early in the game and keep the chain going on and on. Now, to complement this, we also, as we mentioned, have the Null Priest, which functions as more copies of Champion of Dusk in the late game, and Dusk Legion Zealot, which is not to be trifled with. This 1/1 might look innocent, but the fact that it just draws you a card and then you can generate more resources with it by either making it a 2/2 or a 3/3 with the Sorin, or it draws you more card with the champion, or you turn into a Lightning Helix, make this card really important for how this deck functions. But this is one subset of cards. The second one, and I would even argue the more important one for the late game grind, is the land drops, especially the value lands. Look at this. Castle Octwain is amazing in this deck. Castle Octwain is amazing, period. But specifically in this deck, because you have so much life gain, you get to draw so many cards, and you get to use the castle even more aggressively than you would in other decks. It's quite often that versus control decks, you would just draw cards with 3-4 other cards in hand, while still staying over 20 life total, because you still have a Gifted Aetherborn attacking since turn 2 that they haven't dealt with yet, or you just got a Sorin, a couple of Lightning Helix with the Sorin in. Now, this is Castle. Aghanim Awakening is a great addition to the deck. It does two really important things, actually three. The first one, it's generating more board presence. It usually worth at least 2 cards, at least 2 creatures in play, by getting both Knight and a 2-drop back, and God forbid if you get Kalitas and Champion of Dusk too. It generates more cards by getting Champion of Dusk back into play and Dusk Legion Zealot back into play. And it's helping make Sorin's weakness less prevalent, one could say. So Sorin is a really strong card, but it needs you to have a vampire in play. If you don't have a vampire in play, none of the abilities generate real advantage. Aghanim's Awakening virtually gives you more creatures in the deck, thus making Sorin better in the longer, grindier games. And last but not least, Mutavault is huge for this deck, both figuratively and literally. Figuratively because Mutavault is just such a good card. A lot of control decks have a hard time dealing with it, and it's just giving you more to do with your mana in the late game. But also quite literally, because pumping up Mutavault with the Sorin ability and generating a threat that is really hard to interact with is your way to win a lot of games. I have won my fair share of Esper Yorion matchups by pumping a Mutavault up to 4-4 and 5-5 and just attacking for lethal just with it, because this card is so hard for them to deal with. So basically the 10 lands combined with your creatures with ETB effects give you the ability to grind decks into the later game, making it really easy to compete with even decks like Niv Mizzet and Yorion decks in the later stages of the game. And now the third thing I would want to touch on, the third feature that makes this deck what it is the interaction it can present. Look at this, we're playing 8 interactive cards that cost 1 mana, and these cards almost always trade up on mana. Push often hits 3 or 4 mana converted mana cost creatures, and Thoughtseize can take their heavy hitters from their hand, and while they did not deploy them and spend mana to play them per se, the fact that you spent 1 mana to deal with something that would have cost 5 mana but take over the game is really important. And then you have Murderous Rider, which basically covers up almost any other front you have. Just the ability to remove any creature or walker from the battlefield directly means you can control the pacing of the game, which we're going to touch on in a second, and still generate your advantage. And also because of the racing aspect of this deck, the 2-3 lifelink body actually matters. So we talked about 3 features so far, right? We talked about racing, about grinding, and about your interaction being so efficient. What this brings us to is the fact that Vampires, I think, is the best deck in Pioneer at dictating the pace of the game. Now, this might not be so obvious, so let me explain what I mean. Vampires is a deck that can be in any matchup on the initiative. You're basically the one that dictates what your opponent has to do. Did you present your threats first, so your opponent has to answer them? Or did you answer your opponent's threat first, and now they don't have pressure? Do you want to race, or do you want to grind? Do you want to play the longer game, or do you want to play the faster game? The fact that vampires can do all of these things basically means it get to be in control of every matchup that is going on. Even versus control decks, you force them to answer you in a very inefficient and clunky manner. Versus aggressive decks, you force them into a corner of raise my lifelinkers or spend your time answering my threats while I take over the game with my more powerful cards. This puts this deck in a very unique spot where it can beat any kind of deck and it can play any kind of role in any kind of matchup. I think this ability is extremely powerful for this deck. And basically what lends it its power. And let's see how the features play into this. So the fact that you are the best racing deck in the format means you can go aggro versus anyone and know you can win the race. Even versus burn, I often attack on turns 2 and 3 and 4, which might seem really weird because you have to be on the defensive versus that deck. But once you factor in some life gain and some more removal spells, you can understand how this happens. So this is the racing aspect. Now, the grinding aspect means that even if you don't have to go all in on the early aggression because you can play the longer game. So, for example, a deck like Burn, when it plays versus 5-color Niv, it has to be extremely fast because if the Niv player resolves a Haymaker while at high life total, the Burn deck can't get out of this. But this deck, this is fine. Okay, so you wiped my board on turn 3. Sure, I'll untap and I'll present a Sorin and a Champion of Dusk, and now I'm Mutavault, and you're still under pressure while I'm still generating advantage. And now the third part is the efficient interaction. The fact that your interaction is so efficient means you can both make your opponent stumble by taking their threats from their hand or their answers, whatever fits your plan better, and that you often trade up on mana. You push the free drop and keep attacking, and you can probably play another spell on the same turn. So you basically double spell early while keeping the tempo advantage, but you still have the card advantage to keep playing the game and not run out of gas. So I do believe that the fact that this deck can dictate the pace of the game is what makes it a really, really strong deck in Pioneer. Now, this is why I think this deck is good. This is why we want to play vampires. This is what this deck is doing. Now let's talk about some tips and tricks for playing this deck. I have already mentioned the best line this deck can have, and it's the turn 3 Sorin -3 put in a Champion of Dusk into play. This line is so strong that I would often not mill any kind of hand that has Sorin and Champion of Dusk in it. Obviously, if you only have 5 lands and you're on the draw, you should probably mill that deck, but on the play, honestly, I would just keep that hand because this start is so strong it takes over so many games. Frankly, I would even keep any hand that has a Sorin and a Gifted Aetherborn or any of the other cheap vampires in it, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, turn 3 Sorin into Champion is really, really strong. This is a really good interaction to have. Another one, which is a bit more subtle, is Sorin into Kalitas. And this comes in 2 forms. So, imagine it's turn 4, and you just drew a Sorin and you have a Kalitas in a push in hand. You can play the Sorin and minus it to put the Kalitas into play, and then use the push immediately to get a zombie and thus gaining advantage from this Kalitas, which would otherwise could be hard to do because your opponent might have an answer to the Kalitas and you won't untap with it. Another alternative is to play a Legion Zealot into a Sorin plus on this, into a Kalitas, and then sacrifice the Zealot to kill your opponent's creature. This means this is very similar to the last sequence, in which you gain value from the Kalitas the turn it came into play, which is really, really important because this card has no enter the battlefield ability, so you would have to untap with it in most of the times to get advantage. Sorin helps go around that and give you the advantage on the same turn, again, more tempo advantage from Sorin. Another really cool interaction, which is not unique to this deck, but is very important to know, is of Knight of the Ebon Legion. So the second ability on the Knight states that at the beginning of your end step, if a player lost 4 or more life this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Knight. This ability is really important. It draws the Knight really, really fast, making it much more relevant in combat without investing mana in it. Now, the clearest way to pump the Knight is by attacking with a couple of creatures that deal 4 or more damage. But this deck has another couple of ways to do it. First of all, a knight into a double Thoughtseize will make you lose 4 life on the same turn, meaning the knight gets pumped. Another alternative is combining Aghanim Awakening untapped with either a Thoughtseize or a Dusk Legion Zealot to pump the knight early. And third, which often doesn't come up, is that Champion of Dusk can deal you 4 damage if you have 4 or more vampires. Obviously, if you're in that spot, you're probably winning anyway. But that's an important thing to notice and remember when you're playing the Knight of the Even Legion. Now, talking about Champion of Dusk, one of the most cool interactions and important ones is the Mutavault interaction. If you play the Knight and you have a spare mana, the champion, my bad, you can animate the Mutavault to generate another vampire. Even if you just tap Mutavault to animate itself, it will still be a creature, even though tapped, and would count towards the vampire's ability to draw you more and more cards. This mostly happens when you use the Sorin to put it into play and you still have a mana spare, but also happens often in the late game. So remember that Mutavault feeds the champion. Now Mutavault, as I mentioned, does not only feed the champion, it also feeds the Sorin. I have used Mutavault as a removal spell with the Lightning Helix ability. I have pumped it up to big sizes to attack into some enormous board states. And this ability is not to be understated because, as I mentioned, Sorin doesn't do anything if you don't have a vampires, and with Mutavault you virtually have 4 more vampires in your deck. Now, another thing I want to touch on, and this is not a trick, this is more of a tip. So, how do you play Sorin? I tend to play Sorin in a manner that protects it the most. Now, what does that even mean? It means different things versus different decks. One example is versus control decks. Unless I have multiple Sorins in my hand, I would not run out the Sorin unless I am sure I can resolve it or I can generate a really big advantage by running it into a counterspell. Otherwise, I would just wait patiently until I can deploy it in a safe spot, because a Sorin in play with 1 vampire just puts your opponent in a really awkward spot. On the other hand, versus aggressive decks, I would try and deploy Sorin in the spot where I can protect it on the board. So that usually means that, especially on the draw, you don't want to put Sorin into play and immediately minus it on turn 3, because they could very easily get rid of it with either with a flying creature or with a burn spell or with a removal spells for your blockers and attacking down the Sorin. So your priority should be getting to a board state where you can play Sorin and use one of the plus abilities to protect it, either by pumping a blocker or forcing a trade of one of your cards with theirs, and putting yourself in a good position with a high loyalty walker in play. Now, another important thing that you wanna keep in mind when playing versus aggressive decks, and any kind of creature deck really, this also works for mid-range decks, is that your creatures are somewhat undercosted, especially Gifted Aetherborn and Knight of the Even Legion and Kalitas. They're undercosted in the sense that once you have one of these in play, it can often hold back 2, even 3 attackers from your opponent. What this means is that you don't have to use your pushes and your riders in an aggressive manner. You can just keep them for what really matters from your opponent. And this is really felt in the mono-black aggro matchup. In the mono-black aggro matchup, you usually don't want to use the Murderous Riders on cheap creatures or the pushes if you can afford to, because their way to beat you is to resolve a Rankle or a Spawn of Mayhem that goes uncontested. So you want to make sure you have answers to this while using a 2-3 Knight or a 2-3 Gifted Aetherborn or just the Kalitas to hold them back while you're gaining advantage with your cards. This also applies to the matchup versus Rakdos Arcanist. Usually, Young Pyromancer is not a concern to you because a single Gifted Aetherborn is enough to virtually stop 3 token attacks every turn. So you're not really in a rush to remove the Pyromancer as much as you really want to remove Croxa or Arcanist, which generate more and more advantage the more they attack. Now, obviously this doesn't always work. Sometimes you just have to use your removals early to keep board position or to deploy an early Sorin, and that's okay, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, these are some of my tips and tricks for the deck. We're gonna go over the sideboard now. And the sideboarding with this deck is mostly straightforward. Anyway, I do have a sideboard guide. You can find it in the Discord link in my comments below, in the description below, my bad. But we're gonna go over some of the roles the sideboard cards play here. So first of all, we're gonna talk about the Rankles here. Rankle is a really strong card. It helps you in matchups where you don't need to fight on the board, or you don't need to create an insurmountable board position as much as you want to control the resources both players have. So basically in most matchups where you don't want the Kalitas, you want to bring in the Rankles. Now Liliana is a good way to complement the Rankle because Rankle is a legendary creature. You don't want to get stuck with two of these in hand, and also 3 flying can kind of get brickwalled in the late game, so having a walker is a really nice option, especially when this walker is also a removal spell, which you do want to keep some in the deck, so this is a good hedge for that. Now, in almost all the matchups where I don't want the Kalitas, I would just sideboard out 3 Kalitas for these 3 cards and be done with it, but some matchups I want to have both. These matchups are Niv Mizzet and Auras. Versus Niv Mizzet, Kalitas plays an important role because they actually do run some creatures, so having the ability is valuable, and also they have Uro, so having a nice answer, preemptive answer to Uro is really important, but I definitely don't want the 3, so I'll stream 1. And then I'll bring in the Rankles, which help control their hand and control the board by using the sack ability, although it's kind of hard to get past and visit. Now, another interesting matchup, as I mentioned, is the Auras matchup, where Kalitas, while it might look good, it's not good in the way the matchup actually plays out. Auras usually kill you by having a really large creature that you can't profitably interact with, so Rankle gives you a plan of wiping out the rest of their board and then using the sack ability to get rid of even hard to deal with creatures that either have pro black or hexproof. So Rankle is actually very important in that matchup. So we talked about these 3 cards. We also have a couple of Agonizing Remorses. Remorse is a great discard spell to complement Thoughtseize in matchups where the board matters less and you want to sideboard out some removal spells. Now, why Remorse over Duress? 2 reasons. The first one is that hitting creatures matters. You want to hit Uro, you want to hit Niv Mizzet, you want to hit Yorion, you want to hit Agent of Treachery, and Duress misses all of this. Moreover, Agonizing Remorse exiles, which is very relevant with Uro and Elspeth Conquers Death in the format, so I really been enjoying playing these Agonizing Remorses to complement the Thoughtseize in the main deck. 3 Necromentia might look to you like a lot, but in fact, it's coming in 3 of your most difficult matchups, which are Oops All Spells, Lotus Combo, and Jeskai Luka. In all of them, in Jeskai Luka, Necromentia serves to hit their Agent of Treachery, thus meaning that they have a much weaker late game, giving you a chance to compete in a really tough matchup. Versus Lotus and Oops All Spells, it's basically stopping the combo from killing you and giving you time to mount some kind of offense to pressure your opponent. Because, as we mentioned, you're good at racing, but not at goldfishing. Your goldfish is kind of slow. So you need a way to interact with your opponent, slow them down in order to win the game. Now, the zombies that you give your opponent almost never matter because a 2/2 is really like your deck thrives on beating 2/2s your opponent has in play. Look at this. We have Knight, we have Gifted Etherborn, we have a bunch of like big threats. So the 2/2 doesn't matter, but getting rid of one of their biggest cards does matter. So Necromentia is important and 3 copies are a must. 2 copies of Soulguide Lantern serve to help the Oops All Spells matchup, which is quite nice once you add these and the Necromentia and the discard spells. But they're also good in the Rakdos and Sultai Delirium matchups, where your opponents are trying to go to the late game with you, but they're very reliant on the yard, making their cards better, and Lantern is a really good way to stop that, or just a redraw sometimes when you need it. It's not a must-have, but I do like having it in the current metagame, with Oops and Rakdos and Delirium seeing a lot of play. Now, as you might have noticed, we already have 16 cards in the sideboard, because I already have I have a slightly expanded removal suit here, because I tend to change it depending on the way the format looks. So first of all, we have Bloodchiss First. This card is really good at playing some kind of like a bad push, bad Murderous Rider role, but sometimes you just need the extra removal spell, and it's somewhat efficient, not very efficient, but it's good enough for what we want to do that I always want to run one of these, as long as like Burn and Mono Black Aggro are decks in the format. Second card is the Single Heartless Act, which is a very good way to stop 3-drops and 4-drops from aggro decks, because sometimes these give you trouble. Activating push is not as easy in this deck because you don't have Fabled Passage, so having access to 1 Heartless Act is really, really important. Now, I would usually pick 3 out of these 4 removal spells. 2 Legion's End are very good right now in the format. They're pretty good versus Rakdos Arcanist because exiling cards actually matters, removing tokens actually matters. They're decent versus elf decks because removing a bunch of tokens, Nissa lands, or a bunch of elves is pretty good, although I tend to sideboard only 1 versus them unless I'm on the play, and then I might consider 2. And then it's really good versus Burn, because they tend to have multiples of the same creature, and they also use lures to buy them back, and this goes around that. And versus Mono Black aggro, where specifically their 2-drops can be difficult to beat, because Scrounger and Skyclave Shade attack pretty profitably into all of your creatures in the early game. To complement these, I'm right now playing 1 Noxious Grasp for the Mono Green Devotion matchup. This hits walkers and is really cheap. But it's also quite a fine card versus Auras and Niv Mizzet and Omnath decks. So Noxious Grasp is just a good catch-all, but I don't think it's extremely necessary, and you could probably play a Soul Shatter over it. The biggest advantage of Soul Shatter is that it answers cards like Apostle of Purifying Light and Adant of Vanguard, which could be kind of hard to defeat without it. So, and it's also just a good catch-all for some other matchups when you want 1 more Planeswalker removal. I would also sideboard it in versus Mono Black aggro and versus Burn on the draw where I want to trim 1 Champion of Dusk. So, to sum the sideboard up, I would definitely play these 14 cards right now and choose between one of these 2. Yeah, this is basically my thoughts on the deck. Let me give you some sideboarding tips. Sideboarding, as I mentioned, is pretty straightforward. I think the most important thing to recognize about sideboarding with this deck is that you need to figure out if the matchup you're playing is about the board or about the resources. So, for example, when you're playing versus Burn, obviously the matchup is about playing to the board. When you're playing versus Sultai Reclamation, obviously the matchup is not about the board, but about stopping their engines from going on and thus attacking their hand. But the trickier matchups are the mid-range matchups. So, for example, I have found that the Rakdos Arcanist matchup tends to be more about the board than about their hand, which is why I sideboard out the Thoughtseize in this matchup to bring in more removal spells. This might sound counterintuitive, but it does end up working a lot of the time, so I would recommend thinking hard about the matchups, and if you have any questions, just ask me, because I have played this deck a lot. Another tip is obviously that you don't want to have too many high drops, so I would never cut the Sorin from the deck, and I would never trim more than 1 champion and 1 rider, except versus, so I would cut more riders versus the combo matchups, obviously because you don't need the removal spells, but in normal matchups I wouldn't cut these. But the Kalitas can be kind of clunky and not that strong, especially when you bring in the Liliana and the Ranko, so I would definitely trim or cut these entirely. Other than this, it's usually straightforward. You probably want to cut pushes when you bring in the discard spells, and you want to cut the Thoughtseize when you bring in the removal spells. One more thing, and I think it's really important, is that I almost never cut more than 1 or 2 of these vampires, despite them being somewhat mediocre in a lot of matchups post-board. Eventually, they are really vital to your plan, because without the cheap vampires, Sorin is much weaker and Champion is much weaker, and without early pressure, Mutavault is not doing as much, and Agnes Awakening is not doing as much, and the lifelink is important for Castle. So I tend to keep these in as much as I can, but I do trim on 1 or 2 post-board when I know the games will probably just go longer, and the cards will probably have to be more high impact to work. So, that will be it for today. Thank you all for joining me on this journey with vampires. If you want to see more of my content, please go below to the description. You can see links to my Twitter, to my Twitch, where I stream 4 days a week, and to my Discord, where I put on more content, including a sideboard guide for this deck, specifically this build for this weekend. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and thank you all for joining. I hope you have a great day, and see you for the next video.